"Ma'am, you need to step back behind the white line immediately," Miller said, his voice dropping into that rehearsed gravelly bass that NCOs used when they wanted to sound older than 24. "This is a restricted ceremonial area. The public seating is 50 yards to the left. If you can't find it, I can have a private escort you, but you cannot stand here." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't even turn her head fully toward him. She kept her eyes fixed on the young Honor Guard members who were currently undergoing their final inspection. Her eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, seemed to be scanning the rifles rather than the men holding them. "The line is for safety, Sergeant," Eleanor replied, her voice remarkably steady. It lacked the quaver of age. Instead, it had a resonant, melodic quality that seemed to carry further than his bark. "I'm well aware of where the line is. I'm also aware that the third man in your second rank has a loose stacking swivel. If he goes into a high port spin, that rifle is going to fly." Miller blinked, his brow furrowing. He didn't even look back at his men. He was too insulted by the idea of a civilian, especially an elderly woman, critiquing his detail. "Ma'am, I don't need advice on my detail's equipment. I need you to move. Now, this isn't a tourist attraction. These are active duty soldiers performing a high-stakes ceremony for the secretary's arrival. You're a distraction." Eleanor finally turned her gaze to him. It wasn't an angry look. It was the look of a professor watching a student fail a very simple math problem. "Distractions are part of the training, Sergeant. If a red jacket breaks their concentration, they aren't ready for the deck." Miller's face flushed a deep, angry crimson that nearly matched her coat. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way he would never have dared with a man of his own rank. "Listen, sweetheart, I'm going to make this simple. Move your feet or I'll have base security move them for you. You retirees think just because you have a dependent ID or spent a few years in the reserves 40 years ago you own the place. You're in the way of real soldiers." The insult hung in the air, cold and jagged. Eleanor's posture seemed to change. She didn't grow taller, but the way she held her shoulders, the perfect level line of them, suggested a structural integrity that the red tweed couldn't hide. She looked at his name tag, then back to his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Miller," she said softly. "You have a lot to learn about what a real soldier looks like." The tension was broken by a sudden sharp clatter. It was the sound every drill instructor hears in their nightmares. The rhythmic snapping of the manual of arms had begun as the inspecting officer approached the second rank. Just as Eleanor had predicted, the third man in the second rank, a nervous specialist named Hauer, attempted a lightning-fast transition from shoulder arms to a spinning present arms. The loose swivel caught. The balance of the 9.5-pound rifle shifted mid-air. The M1 Garand didn't just fall. It bucked. Hauer lunged for it, his white-gloved hands slipping against the polished wood. The rifle hit the asphalt with a sickening metallic crack, the butt plate bouncing once before the weapon slid across the deck, coming to a rest right at Eleanor Sutton's feet. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. The inspecting officer froze. Miller froze, his jaw dropping in a mixture of horror and pure, unadulterated rage. In the world of the ceremonial guard, dropping a piece was more than a mistake. It was a profanation. It was a failure of the highest order. Hauer stood paralyzed, his hands still shaped as if they were holding air, his face pale as a ghost. He looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. Miller recovered his voice first, but it wasn't a command. It was a snarl directed at the air. He began to march toward Hauer, his intent to humiliate the boy clear in every stride. But before he could reach the fallen soldier, something happened that stopped every heart on the parade ground. Eleanor Sutton moved. She didn't shuffle. She didn't lean over with the careful ginger movements of the elderly. She pivoted on her heel with a mechanical efficiency that was so sudden it was startling. In one fluid motion she reached down. Her right hand snapped onto the small of the stock, her left hand finding the handguard with the kind of blind certainty that only comes from thousands of hours of repetition. In a blur of red tweed she brought the heavy rifle up. Miller stopped in his tracks, his eyes bulging. "Ma'am, put that down. That is government property. Do not touch that weapon." He lunged forward to grab it from her, his hand outstretched to snatch the Garand away. Eleanor didn't back down. With a flick of her wrists that was almost too fast to follow, she brought the rifle to a high port, the barrel clearing Miller's reaching hand by a fraction of an inch. The movement was so sharp, the wind of the rifle's passage actually made Miller flinch. She didn't stop there. While Miller stood there stunned, Eleanor performed a series of movements that weren't in the standard modern manual. They were older, more complex, and infinitely more difficult. She spun the rifle behind her back, the heavy wood and steel whistling through the air, catching it with her left hand without looking. She executed a triple spin into a flatline catch, the slap of her palms against the wood echoing across the entire parade deck like a pistol shot. The sound was perfect. It was the sound of a master. Across the field, in the shade of the command tent, an older man with 3 stars on his shoulders and a chest full of ribbons stood up from his chair. He pushed his sunglasses down his nose, his mouth slightly agape. Beside him, a command sergeant major with a face like a topographical map of the Mojave Desert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who is that?" the lieutenant general whispered. The sergeant major didn't answer immediately. He was watching the way the woman in the red jacket handled the Garand. She was doing the Lost 13 Inches sequence, a series of drill movements so dangerous and difficult they had been phased out of the standard repertoire in the late 80s because too many guardsmen were breaking their wrists trying to learn them. The sergeant major's voice was a low growl of disbelief. "Sir, there is only one person I ever saw move a piece that fast, but she's been retired for 20 years. Back on the deck, Miller was reaching the breaking point of his patience and his ego. He felt the eyes of the entire base on him. He felt the shame of his soldier dropping the rifle, and now he was being shown up by a grandmother playing with a weapon as if it were a baton. "That is enough," Miller screamed. He reached out again, this time putting his weight into it, intending to tackle the woman if necessary to regain control of the situation. "Security. I need security on the deck," he yelled over his shoulder. But as he moved in, a voice boomed out from the speakers, amplified by the heavy-duty PA system of the reviewing stand. It wasn't the voice of the announcer. It was the voice of the base commander, who had snatched the microphone. "Staff Sergeant Miller, stand down. That is a direct order. Stand fast." Miller froze, 1 foot in the air, looking like a cartoon character caught in a trap. He looked toward the reviewing stand, seeing the lieutenant general and the base commander sprinting, not walking but sprinting toward their position. Eleanor Sutton didn't look at the officers. She looked at the young specialist Hauer, who was still shaking. She held the rifle out to him, her movements suddenly gentle, returning to the civilian persona as quickly as she had shed it. She held the rifle at the balance point, perfectly leveled. "Check your swivel next time, son," she said softly, so only the boy could hear, "and never let them see you shake. The rifle knows when you're afraid of it." Hauer took the weapon with trembling hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The general reached them first, his breath coming in short bursts. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the dropped rifle. He stopped 3 feet in front of Eleanor and, to the absolute shock of everyone watching, he snapped the sharpest salute of his career. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't seen that sequence since the '84 trials at Fort Belvoir." Eleanor Sutton smiled, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. She returned the salute, her hand hitting her brow with the crispness of a razor blade. "Hello, Robert," she said. "I see you finally got that 3rd star. I told you that you were too stubborn to stay a colonel." The general laughed, a short bark-like sound, and turned to the crowd of soldiers and officers who were now congregating. He looked at Miller, who was standing there like a statue of confusion. "Staff Sergeant Miller," the general said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet tone. "Do you have any idea who you were just threatening to arrest?" Miller swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was full of sand. "No, sir. She was over the line, sir. I was just enforcing the perimeter." The general stepped closer to Miller, his face inches from the NCO's. "This is Eleanor Sutton. But when she wore the uniform, she was Command Sergeant Major Sutton. She was the first woman to ever command the Honor Guard. She was the woman who literally wrote the manual you studied to get your stripes. She was the one who integrated the drill teams when the brass said women didn't have the upper body strength to handle a Garand. She didn't just handle it, Sergeant. She outperformed every man in the Atlantic Command for 6 years straight." A murmur went through the crowd. The younger soldiers looked at Eleanor with a new kind of intensity. They were looking at a pioneer, a legend they had heard about in whispered stories during basic training, the Red Queen of the drill floor, a woman who could outmarch, outspin, and outdiscipline anyone in the service. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes moving from the general to Miller. She saw the fear in the young man's eyes, the realization that he had just committed professional suicide by insulting a living legend of his own branch. "General," she said, her voice calm. "The sergeant was just doing his job. He was a bit overzealous, perhaps, a bit quick to make assumptions based on a tweed jacket and a few gray hairs. But the standards are the standards." She turned to Miller. "Sergeant Miller, you told me that I was a distraction. You told me that I was in the way of real soldiers. Do you know why I was standing 6 inches over your line?" Miller shook his head, unable to speak. "I was standing there because from that specific angle, the sun hits the barrels of the 2nd rank. If the oil isn't wiped perfectly thin, You get a glare that can blind the man behind them during a rotation. I was checking your work, Sergeant, and your work was sloppy. You were so worried about the spectator line that you didn't see the loose swivel on Specialist Hauer's piece. You were so worried about the look of your detail that you forgot the soul of it. She walked closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt heavier than a shout. A real soldier doesn't need to bark at an old woman to prove he's in charge. A real soldier knows his equipment, knows his people, and knows that the uniform doesn't make the man, the discipline does. You failed your soldier today. You let him go onto the deck with a faulty piece, and then you were going to berate him for a mechanical failure you should have caught in the pre-inspection. Miller looked down at his boots, his face pale. The general looked at the base commander. Colonel, I think Staff Sergeant Miller and his detail could use some remedial training, and I think I know just the person to supervise it if she's willing to stay for lunch. Eleanor looked at the young men in the detail. She saw their potential, buried under the bravado and the nerves. She saw the same spark she had felt 40 years ago when she was a young private fighting for the right to even hold a weapon in a ceremonial capacity. In her mind, a flash of memory hit her, a flash echo of a rain-slicked tarmac in 1979. She remembered the weight of the rifle, the way the men around her had sneered waiting for her to drop it. She remembered the blisters that bled through her white gloves and the way she had practiced until her arms were numb just so she would never give them the satisfaction of seeing her fail. She remembered the day she finally won the competition, the way the silence had felt then, the same silence that was over the parade ground now. I'm retired, Robert, Eleanor said, looking at the general. But I suppose I could spare a few hours. These boys need to learn that the rifle isn't a prop, it's a responsibility. The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of activity. The ceremony proceeded, but the energy had shifted. The secretary arrived, but the gossip among the ranks wasn't about the dignitary, it was about the woman in the red jacket. After the official festivities concluded, Eleanor didn't go to the officers' club for a fancy lunch. Instead, she stayed on the parade deck. She had Miller bring his entire detail to the equipment shed. She took off the red tweed jacket, revealing a simple, high-collared white blouse. She rolled up her sleeves. Her forearms were lean, the muscles corded and firm, a testament to a lifetime of physical activity. She picked up Hauer's rifle. "Bring me a toolkit," she commanded. Miller scrambled to obey. For the next 3 hours, Eleanor Sutton didn't just teach them how to spin a rifle. She taught them the mechanics. She showed them how a single loose screw could change the center of gravity. She showed them how to feel the tension in the wood. She stood in front of Miller, who was now holding his own rifle, his posture more rigid than it had ever been. "You think because you're young and strong you can muscle the piece," she said. "That's your first mistake. You don't muscle a garand. You dance with it. If you fight the weight wins." She took his rifle and with a movement so effortless it looked like magic, she launched it into a vertical spin. It stayed perfectly in place, rotating like a propeller, before she caught it with a snap that sounded like a whip cracking. "Now," she said, handing it back. "Again. And this time, Sergeant, look at the weapon, not the horizon. Respect the steel." By the end of the afternoon, the detail was exhausted, but they were different. The arrogance had been replaced by a grim, focused determination. Miller, in particular, seemed transformed. The sneer was gone. When he looked at Eleanor, he didn't see an old woman. He saw the standard he was supposed to live up to. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the Potomac, Eleanor put her red jacket back on. She looked at the young men who were now standing in a semicircle around her, their rifles held at a perfect order arms. "Why do we do this?" she asked them. "Why do we spin these rifles? Is it for the tourists? Is it for the secretary?" "No, ma'am," Hauer said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "It's for the ones who can't hold them anymore," Eleanor said. "It's a demonstration of the precision, the discipline, and the absolute reliability that the American soldier represents. If we can't even handle a rifle in a ceremony without dropping it, how can the people trust us to handle a rifle in a foxhole? Every movement you make is a promise. Don't break it." She turned to Miller. "Sergeant, a word." The others stepped back. Miller approached her, his head slightly bowed. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for what I said, for how I acted. I was out of line, deeply out of line." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She saw the genuine shame in his eyes, and she saw the realization of his own hubris. "You're young, Miller. Youth is a type of blindness. You see the surface of things. You see age as a decline, and gender as a limitation. But in this man's army, the only thing that matters is if you can do the job. I spent 30 years proving I could do the job better than the men who told me I couldn't. Don't make the mistake of thinking the trail was blazed by people weaker than you. She reached into the pocket of her red jacket and pulled out a small tarnished silver coin. It was a challenge coin, but older than the ones usually seen today. It featured the crest of the old guard on one side and a pair of crossed rifles on the other. "I earned this in 1981, she said, placing it in his hand. "It's a reminder that the standards don't change, even when the people do. Keep it, and the next time you see someone who doesn't look like your idea of a soldier, remember today. Remember that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is often the one you didn't bother to notice." Miller gripped the coin, his knuckles white. "Thank you, Command Sergeant Major." Eleanor nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. She turned and began the long walk back toward the parking lot. Her gait was steady, her back straight, her red jacket a beacon in the gathering gloom. As she walked, she passed a group of young female soldiers, privates and specialists who had been watching the training from a distance. They didn't say anything, but as she passed, they instinctively straightened their posture. One of them, a young woman with her hair in a tight regulation bun, gave a small, respectful nod. Eleanor returned the nod. She knew the road they were on. She knew the hurdles they would face, the subtle slights and the overt challenges to their presence. But she also knew that they had seen what was possible. They had seen that the Red Queen was real, and that the steel they carried didn't care about the color of their hair or the year they were born. In the command office, the general watched her through the window until she disappeared from sight. He looked down at a folder on his desk, her service record. It was thick, filled with citations for valor, commendations for technical excellence, and letters of appreciation from 4 different presidents. He flipped to the back, to a photograph from the early 80s. It showed a young Eleanor, her face smeared with camouflage grease, holding a rifle in the mud of a training range. She looked fierce, unstoppable. Underneath the photo was a quote from her final evaluation before retirement. "Command Sergeant Major Sutton does not merely meet the standard, she defines it. To underestimate her is the last mistake any adversary or subordinate will ever make." The general closed the folder and looked at the base commander. "Make sure the new SOP for the gate and the parade deck reflects what happened today," he said. "No one, and I mean no one, is to be dismissed based on their appearance. And I want a formal invitation sent to Eleanor for the anniversary ball. Put her at the head table." "Yes, sir," the colonel replied. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the trees that lined the cemetery. The honor guard detail was still on the deck, even though their duty day was technically over. Led by Staff Sergeant Miller, they were practicing the Lost 13. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all forms, and subscribe to She Chose Valor to honor the women who paved the way for us all. Thank you for watching, and thank you to all our veterans for your service.